late, so we're going to go ahead and start. Hello, my name is Maria Alm, and I'm Dean of the College of Arts, Communication, Humanities, and Social Sciences here at UW-Stout, and I have the pleasure of introducing one of our keynote speakers for the symposium, Reggie Jackson. Reggie Jackson is a graduate of Concordia University, and he currently serves as head griot of America's Black Holocaust Museum in Milwaukee. For those of you who are not familiar with the term griot, he has promised to explain it to us during his comments this afternoon. Reggie served as the original museum's board of directors from 2005 to 2017, including 2 terms as chair. Later, he became Dr. Cameron's protege, and since his mentor's death, he is one of the few experts on the life of this unsung civil rights hero. He is the 2015 winner of the Eliminating Racism Award from Southeast Wisconsin's YWCA and the 2016 Courageous Love Award from the First Unitarian Society. He is the 2017 winner of the Frank P. Zeidler Public Service Award from the City of Milwaukee and the recipient of the first annual MICAH Legacy Award in 2018. Mr. Jackson has agreed to speak to us for approximately an hour, after which 2 of my colleagues, Dr. Glenda Jones and Dr. Virginia Lee, will serve as respondents. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to get started because I have a lot of information I want to share with you all. I'm going to begin by telling you what a griot is. So I am one of the griots at America's Black Holocaust Museum, a museum founded in 1988 by a lynching survivor, a man by the name of James Cameron. We lost Dr. Cameron in 2006. And the physical museum closed 2 years after he passed away. We are in the process of having a new building built for us, and we plan to reopen this summer on June 19th. So I've been a griot at the museum. The people that will give you tours at the museum, when you go to most museums, they're known as docents, but we refer to ourselves as griots in the tradition of West African oral historians. So in the French-speaking part of West Africa, all of the oral historians are known as griots. That's one of the words that's used. There are several others as well. And I've been a griot at the museum since 2002. So I want to go ahead and jump into the presentation and talk about what we'll cover. We're going to talk about certain rights described in the Bill of Rights today, issues related to who is welcome to live in Wisconsin, look at some of the precedents that were set early on, look at some First Amendment challenges, policing disparities, particularly policing disparities in the state's largest city, Milwaukee, look at 5th and 6th Amendment issues, incarceration disparities here in Wisconsin as well as nationally, and then look lastly at the issue of people that are killed by police, to look at some statistics related directly to that. So one of the questions that I always ask people is, why do we need a civil rights movement? We had rights that were supposedly given to these African Americans when they were given their freedom with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which ended slavery, the 14th and 15th Amendment. Those Reconstruction Amendments, as they're known, were supposed to give them all of the rights, and so they would be standing on equal footing with the rest of Americans, but it hasn't necessarily played out that way. And the primary reason that it hasn't is because there have always been, even though we have these laws in place, I always say that without laws being enforced, it doesn't matter if the law is on the books or not. So civil liberties are limitations on the power of government designed to ensure personal freedoms. This is the very basic, simple understanding of what civil liberties are. And so as we look at how these are played out, particularly for African Americans in America, we'll see that those limitations on the power of government have been violated in many respects. This is a quote that I really love from Dr. Du Bois. He said this way back in 1947. If, however, the effect of the color caste system on the North American Negro has been both good and bad, its effect on white America has been disastrous. A great nation finds itself continuously making common cause with race hate, prejudice, exploitation, and oppression. And Dr. Du Bois was a person who worked early on to kind of give America an opportunity to rethink its assumptions about race and racism, to relook at how race and racism impacts all of us as a nation. And he wanted us to move forward, but he didn't feel that we were making a whole lot of progress because many people were still having the same beliefs that they had when those blacks who were enslaved were given their freedom many, many years earlier. So the Bill of Rights, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and all of these are amendments and these rights, the rights that all of us as Americans are supposed to have available to us based on the language in the Constitution. However, a simple study of American history shows that that hasn't necessarily been the case for everybody. So we're going to look at some instances of how some of these rights guaranteed in the Constitution have not been afforded to people of African descent here in America. And we're not going to cover all 10 of the amendments. We're just going to cover a handful of them. But I want to begin by telling you that the battle is a never-ending battle. For blacks in America to attain these same rights, it's a never-ending battle. It's been a battle since the first Africans arrived on the shores of Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, and it continues. Here in Wisconsin, which has always had this reputation as a very progressive state, I want to show you something that I'm sure most of you are unaware of. There were attempts early on, in the early years of Wisconsin statehood, to keep the state all white. There were people who didn't want certain people to live in the state, and they tried to get the state government to pass a bill that would exclude blacks from moving into the state of Wisconsin. Fortunately, as you can see, this bill did not pass, but that was not the last effort to do the exact same thing. 7 months later, another politician in the state proposed something very similar, and this rant that he went on is known as Ryan's Address. And he said, "We hold this country to be the possession of the white race, and this government to be instituted by white men for white men." And this wasn't just the case here in Wisconsin. This was the case in several other states around the country. Oregon passed a new constitution in the late 1890s, which actually barred black people from moving to the state. The state of Indiana required blacks to pay $300 to live in the state in the 1850s. So there have been consistent efforts, not just here in Wisconsin, but in other places as well. And then here's another one. January of 1863, Negro Exclusion Bill was authored by a man from Milwaukee, and he introduced this to the legislation. And it was designed, in his language, to protect white workers from what he called competition with the African race. And this one failed as well. But you can see that even though each of these attempts failed, that idea was in the air consistently for a number of years. So let's look at the First Amendment, which is the one that we really cherish, the freedom of speech, the right to assemble. And obviously, throughout our history, there have been times where blacks have wanted to express this speech related to the way that they were treated in the country, and they wanted to assemble in large groups to protest different things. And one of those that we're actually celebrating in Milwaukee this year are the open housing marches. These are marches that took place over a period of 200 consecutive days, beginning in August of 1967 and went all the way through March of 1968. They were marching to the south side of Milwaukee. The south side of Milwaukee was the part of Milwaukee that was populated primarily by whites, and then there was a small Latino population there as well. There were no blacks who were allowed to live on the south side of Milwaukee. And so the marches were designed to open up the south side of Milwaukee to blacks being able to move there as residents. And also the north side of Milwaukee, the far north side of Milwaukee, was an area where blacks weren't allowed to live either. And so these marches continued for 200 consecutive days. Shortly after they ended, Dr. King was assassinated. The federal government passed the Federal Fair Housing Act, which eliminated many of the barriers to open housing. And then the city of Milwaukee finally passed an open housing ordinance as well. Primarily as a result of these marches in Milwaukee, it really put a lot of pressure on the federal government and in local as well as state government to pass open housing laws. But one of the things that I found very interesting is as these blacks were marching, that first day they marched, they were met by a crowd of about 5,000 angry whites. The second day, the police estimated the crowd of angry whites to be about 13,000. They were hurling bricks, bottles, raw eggs, bags full of human feces, a variety of different things. Many people were beaten. The police did not do a good job of protecting them, and you can see here some of the whites who were gathered to protest this attempt by blacks to be able to open up housing to other parts of the city. And so these marches were fraught with danger. Many blacks were beaten during the course of this. One of the places that they would meet, that they referred to as the Freedom House, was actually bombed by the police department and burned to the ground. So it was an effort that really had national attention and put national attention on the city of Milwaukee, primarily because of the reaction by whites to these efforts. And so they were successful eventually, but these are not the types of things that stop. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with this young man, football player, was a native of Milwaukee, and really, I'm really still shocked that he doesn't have a job in the NFL, considering the record of his play on the field. But obviously, the fact that he protested and those protests spread to other players has continued to keep him out of the National Football League. The National Football League is still dealing with the after effects of that. They still don't have a specific policy about whether or not they're going to force the players to stand for the national anthem. So it's an ongoing issue that hasn't been resolved by the National Football League. But once again, this is an effort on Colin Kaepernick's part to simply bring awareness to blacks being killed by police, particularly unarmed blacks being killed by police around the country. And the fact that he actually kneeled, that was not his intention initially. He actually got the idea from a former service member. A former military man suggested to him that one of the ways that we show honor to the flag is we actually kneel on a knee and we pay honor to the flag in that way. So that's actually what Colin Kaepernick was attempting to do, was not to dishonor the flag, not to disrespect the flag, but he was using this advice from a friend of his to take a knee to show honor to the flag. And people misconstrued it and said that he was disrespecting the flag, disrespecting the military, all of those different things. And so the narrative actually shifted from what Colin Kaepernick actually tried to say. So let's move on. Another one of the rights that we really, really cherish is, the right to be protected from illegal searches of our persons and our residences. And this is something that many people in America just take for granted, that this is absolutely a concrete right that we have. However, that's not the case for many in the black community. There was an infamous case in Milwaukee a number of years ago where police officers were doing strip searches of mostly African American men, but some women as well, literally right out in the public in front of anybody who happened to be standing there or walking past or driving past. They conducted these rectal searches. They made people drop their clothing right out in public and humiliated these people. And they did this consecutively for four years. And obviously many of these people complained to the police department. They filed complaints on a regular basis. However, they pretty much ignored the complaints. It wasn't until a reporter from the local newspaper found out about this and began to investigate that they finally, opened up this to a real investigation by the police department. The officers were charged by the district attorney's office, and this is just an example of one of the things that they were said to have done, according to the criminal complaint. In one case, an officer held a gun to a man's head as two others held his arms, and the third put him in a chokehold while jamming a hand into his anus, purportedly searching for evidence. Another man bled from his rectum for several days after his encounter with police. Now, of these four officers, only one of them spent any time in jail, and one who was really facing the most charges was facing 25 charges. He ended up basically getting a slap on the wrist from the district attorney's office, and it was really one of these things where people in the black community were well aware that these things happened because, many people had been involved in incidents similar to this with the police department, even in other parts of the city. So it wasn't something that was new to the black community. However, for whites in the city, they were completely shocked that these things were happening, that they occurred over a long period of time. And of course, the people who were victimized by this, there were nearly 80 people who filed a lawsuit against the city of Milwaukee, and it was finally settled. In addition to this case and other cases of misconduct by the police, the city of Milwaukee has paid, since 2015, over $20 million in, settling these lawsuits. So these are things that people within the city of Milwaukee and the black community are well aware of and really are continuing to fight against the police department. We have a new police chief, and we're hoping that some things change in the city as a result of the new police chief. Our former chief, Chief Flynn, just retired in February. So another thing that's an issue in the city of Milwaukee in particular, and the reason I keep mentioning Milwaukee, I'm from Milwaukee, and a majority of the African Americans in the state of Wisconsin live in only 4 counties. So there are only 4 counties in the state where the black population is more than 10,000 people: Milwaukee, Racine, Kenosha, and Dane counties. And so 85% of the blacks in the state live in southeast Wisconsin. So, of course, Milwaukee is the largest city. One of the other issues we have this saying in the black community that we call driving while black. And there's evidence that traffic stops by the Milwaukee Police Department really are attempts to racially profile. So one of the things that really surprised me, and this is all evidence from the Milwaukee Police Department records, from 2013 to 2015, there were 415,000 traffic stops by the Milwaukee Police Department, which seems a shockingly large number. 66% of the people who were pulled over were black, and only 21% were white. If you look at the city of Milwaukee, the demographics of the city of Milwaukee, non-Hispanic whites are 37% of the population in Milwaukee. Blacks are 40% of the population. Latinos are 17.3% of the population. Asians are 3.5% of the population in the city. So you can see that there was a great deal of disparity. But to look at it in an even deeper way, if you look at specific areas of the city. So Milwaukee is the most segregated metropolitan area in the country. The city of Milwaukee has neighborhoods that are pretty much all black, some they're all white, all Latino. It's very, very, segregated in a way that's very easy for people to see. People who live in Milwaukee know the areas where different groups of people live. And so when you look at the stops by police district, these are the 4 worst in terms of the disparity. So if you look at District 1 in Milwaukee, the black population in that area is only 8.4%, but blacks were 66% of the traffic stops. Whites, who were 81% of the population in that district, were only 22% of the traffic stops. In District 2, blacks make up 7.9% of the residents, but they were 64% of those pulled over by police. Whites, who are 16.8% of the population in the neighborhood, were 22% of the traffic stops. The other part of the population there are Latinos. They didn't aggregate this data down to the Latinos on the Milwaukee Police Department report. District 3, the black population is 51.2% in that area. 68% of those pulled over by police were black, and whites were 33%, 20% of those pulled over. And then the worst, by far, District 6, where blacks are only 3.1% of the residents in that district, but they made up 64% of the people pulled over by the police department. And whites, who were 70.3%, were only 22% of those pulled over. So one of the things that I try to tell people that we have to understand is that even in those parts of town in Milwaukee where blacks don't live, it's just simply traversing through those neighborhoods in your car, there's a great chance that you're going to be pulled over by the police. And this is something that I deal with on a daily basis. I spend a lot of time traveling around the city of Milwaukee. I work in a lot of different communities in Milwaukee with a lot of different groups, and so I'm all around the city on a pretty regular basis. And there's always a fear of being pulled over by the police. I actually had a police officer many, many years ago pull me over for making an illegal left turn, which I did. I clearly admitted that I did that. And as the officer came up to my vehicle, I reached to grab my wallet to show him my driver's license, and he had his hand on his gun. He pulled his gun out right in front of me and asked me if I had a death wish. And that has stuck with me, and that was many, many years ago. That was in 1995 when that incident happened. So it's something that we're pretty accustomed to as African Americans in the city of Milwaukee. One of the policies that the city of Milwaukee has followed, which is a policy that was made famous in the city of New York, is this policy of stop and frisk. And This is a policy that was carried out for a number of years in New York. Milwaukee Police Department kind of followed the same policy as well. But let's look at what our current president had to say about this back in 2016, talking about the stop and frisk policies. And then I'll share some information with you about what happened to the policy. And he said that I would do stop and frisk. I see what's going on here. I see what's going on in Chicago. I think stop and frisk. In New York City, it was so incredible the way it worked. And that was what the president said when he was running for office in 2016. What he apparently did not know was that that particular policy had been ruled unconstitutional by a judge in New York in September of 2013 because it was clearly, very clearly from looking at the evidence, just a method of racially profiling blacks and Latinos in the city. And the data from those stop and frisk policies that New York had for a number of years showed that 80% of the individuals that were targeted were people of color. And 90% of the people who were stop and frisk were found to have nothing illegal on their bodies. And one of the things that was very interesting about what they found was that whites were actually more likely to have contraband on them than blacks and Latinos. So the stop and frisk policies, which primarily were used against black and Latino residents of New York, they were shown to be just absolutely nonsensical, and they did not work as President Trump believes that they did. This is some information about stop and frisk policies as compared to crimes in the city of Milwaukee from 2007 to 2015. And one of the things that I found very interesting about this is you can see the orange graph. You can see that from 2007, the numbers are going lower. So you can see that the number of crimes reported to the police are actually dropping. Specifically from 2007 to 2012, crimes reported to the Milwaukee Police Department dropped by 19%. But you can see that stop and frisk by the Milwaukee Police Department grew exponentially from only 14,000 in 2007 to nearly 72,000 by 2012. So at the same time, crimes are going down in the city of Milwaukee. Milwaukee police are stopping and frisking a much, much larger number of people. And part of what came out of that were complaints from citizens in the city of Milwaukee to the Fire and Police Commission. The police department kind of looked at the policy and they made a few changes to it, and those numbers have decreased significantly as a result of that. So you can see that the stop and frisk policy, which we've been told was a policy that was designed to attack the crime that was occurring in the city, it was not assigned that role. It was literally an attempt to racially profile black and Hispanics in Milwaukee as well as other parts of the country. Another thing that we take for granted is due process and having a jury of our peers, as it says in the Constitution. However, there are some misconceptions we have about how this process works. How many of you have ever watched television crime shows, police shows, law? How many of you ever watched Law and Order, right? I used to absolutely love Law and Order. It was one of my favorite shows, and I used to sit and watch in every other episode of Law and Order. They have somebody in the box there interrogating this person, and they're telling this person, if you don't go ahead and fess up, we're going to make sure that we get a needle in your arm as soon as possible, right? They're threatening people with the death penalty. And so I watched this show for years, not knowing that in the state of New York, they have not executed a single individual since 1963. 1963 was the last time New York executed somebody. But if you watch Law and Order and you think Law and Order is real, you assume that they wouldn't lie to you. Why would they lie to you? They're lying to you. And so you have this conception of how the system works. And one of those things that you assume is that the system is fair because they always get a decent attorney, someone comes to the rescue. If the person's innocent, they get off. But in the reality, the real world we live in, it just doesn't work this way. And particularly when it comes to juries. These are just a few fallacies about juries. Several legal protections prohibit the act of excluding potential jurors on the basis of race. However, no specific constitutional or legal guarantee that a sworn juror must be balanced or diverse. There's no guarantee. It doesn't have to be balanced or diverse. There's no law, there's no no policy in place that says that you should have a jury of your peers. Your peers simply mean people who live in the same community you live in. It doesn't mean that if you're a black person, that of those 12 people, that a majority of those people should be black. In many instances in Milwaukee, the number of blacks who are on juries is significantly lower than the number of whites who are on juries. Yet there exists a very public perception that equates impartiality with having a racial composition on the jury that reflects that particular community. However, it doesn't work that way. And to show you evidence from the city of Milwaukee, this is some information from what our juries look like. So, like I said before, the racial composition of Milwaukee is there on the top. And if you look at Milwaukee County jurors in 2006, you see that 79% of sworn jurors in Milwaukee were white, even though whites only make up 40 or 37% of the population in Milwaukee. African Americans, who make up 40% of the population, were only 16% of the jurors in Milwaukee. And Latinos, who make up 17% of the population, were only 3% of all of those sworn jurors. And so what that ends up telling us is that we don't have juries that really reflect your peer group when you're in court. And people assume that you're supposed to have juries that reflect that. But the reality is it's just not the way it works. In Milwaukee, I've sat on juries on 2 different occasions. And on both occasions, I was the only African American selected to be on the jury. All of the rest of the people were white. There is also disparate treatment by the Milwaukee District Attorney's Office. I tell people all the time that the most powerful player by far in the criminal justice system are district attorneys. And I just had a conversation with someone the other day who was complaining about, why don't the police do this, and why don't they, when the police shoot someone who's unarmed, why don't they just charge them like they charge everybody else? And I told him, I said, what you don't get is you don't understand how the system works. We don't have a single criminal justice system in the United States. In fact, we have 3,300 and some odd criminal justice systems, because the criminal justice system is a county-wide system. So you have 3,314, I believe, counties in the United States of America. Each of those has their own district attorney. And so the district attorney in whichever particular county they're in is the most powerful person, because he or she decides who to charge, what to charge you with, whether to plea bargain or not. And 95% of criminal cases in the U.S. are actually, they don't go to trial. They're actually resolved by a plea bargain. So even though you watch Law and Order and people go to trial all the time, it just doesn't happen very much in the real world. And so for those in Milwaukee who have been arrested for possession of drug paraphernalia, that prosecutors decided to decline charging them, 41% of those were whites and 27% blacks. So what we find with the district attorney's office in Milwaukee is that we don't, people in the black community consistently say that they don't feel that the treatment from the district attorney is fair and equitable for blacks as it is for whites. And there's a great deal of evidence to show that depending on the particular crime, that blacks are treated differently than whites. One classic example of this is marijuana. So from 2008 to 2013, these are people who were detained on marijuana cases in Milwaukee. And you can see that by far, 84% of the people detained and eventually charged by the district attorney's office for marijuana possession were black. Remember, blacks only make up 40% of the residents of Milwaukee. And I can tell you, I'm around the city a lot. There's people smoking marijuana all over Milwaukee. It's not just black folks. I can't go anywhere without smelling skunk weed in Milwaukee. It's everywhere. But obviously there are disparities, huge disparities in terms of who is adjudicated for those based on race. And I always tell people that the issue with policing isn't what we do, it's how we do it. Where we choose to put those resources for the police department is the direct result of policies that are made at the local level. So it's not a national issue, it's a local issue. So each particular county, that district attorney, that police chief, the people who are in charge of the system within that particular county, they're the ones that determine how we use the resources of the police department. Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee, 53% of the city's budget is actually spent on the Milwaukee Police Department. 53% of the budget. We have a crisis, a lead crisis, in terms of children having lead in their blood that's 3 times worse than the crisis in Flint, Michigan. We currently have 72,000 homes in Milwaukee that have lead lateral pipes attached to them that the city refuses to spend money on getting rid of, and yet we spend 53% of our budget on the police department instead. Our district attorney, this is a very funny story. He was looking at some data, looking at disparities, and he came across this, and he was really like, oh, wow, this is great. He says, when I first saw the data, I thought, here's some good news. It said that we charge white offenders for property crimes at a higher rate than we do black offenders for those same kind of cases. So I thought, good, here is a disparity the other way. All right, so he's really excited. That must balance things out. But a deputy of mine pointed out that what the data really meant was that we devalue property crimes in the center city. We don't charge a car theft because we think it's just some junker car that's broken down anyway. It meant that we were devaluing our African-American victims of property crimes. So this just shows you how clueless our district attorney is about the reality of life on the streets in Milwaukee. Fifth and Sixth Amendments, right not to face excessive bail, excessive fines, cruel and unusual punishment. One of the things that is a really important part of our criminal justice system here in the state of Wisconsin is that a majority of people who are sent to prison in the state get some form of supervised release once they're released. We got rid of parole in 1999, and the majority of people who get out of prison have some type of supervised release for either a year, 2 years, up to 20 years of supervised release. So that means you have to report to a probation and parole agent, and one of the things that happens is people violate the terms of their supervised release. Every person who is given the supervised release in Wisconsin, there's a list of 18 rules that you have to abide by. And then your probation and parole agent can add additional rules on that as well. And so people who violate those actually can be revoked and sent back to prison. So that means that you don't have to commit a crime. You can simply violate the terms of your supervised release. You can miss a meeting with your probation and parole agent. You can do something like getting a job without permission. I know someone who was revoked because they worked 4 additional hours beyond what their probation agent gave them permission for. I know someone who missed the bus, missed his appointment with his probation agent, and ended up going back to prison for 15 additional years. And so we have this issue of what's called crimeless revocation. And persons can be sent back to prison for any violations of their probation, parole, or supervised release. Just as I said, the district attorneys are the most powerful people within the system. The second most powerful people are probation and parole agents, because they have the latitude to determine whether or not you can go back to prison for violating the terms of your supervised release. And even though you'll have a revocation hearing, you're not given the right to have an attorney there. If you can't afford it, they're not going to give you an attorney. You have to be lucky enough to have someone who has money to hire an attorney. Otherwise, it's just you, your probation and parole agent, and then a judge in the room to determine whether or not you can go back. And even though blacks are only 6.3% of the population of the state, they made up 40% of the people revoked in 2015. Nearly 3,000 people were revoked and sent back to prison under the revocation rules. This just shows you how nonsensical it is. As you can see, reincarceration admission types into Department of Corrections for the state of Wisconsin in 2015. 5.8% of people were reincarcerated because of a new sentence, a new crime that they've been convicted of. 12.7% revocation and new sentence, and 81.5% revocation only. And even though 1/3 of those were eventually charged with a specific crime, that means that 66% of those people were never charged with a new crime, yet they went back to prison anyway. I tracked the data, and over the last 10 years, 38% of the people who've gone to prison in the state of Wisconsin have gone to prison due to revocations only, not new crimes that they've committed. So we have this assumption that everybody that's sitting in a Wisconsin prison is a person that committed a crime, and that's how they got there, and they deserve to be there. However, that's simply not the case. There are dangerous disparities in incarceration in the state, particularly for African Americans. If you look specifically at certain age groups, it's worse than it is for other age groups. So if we look at black males in Wisconsin's population, those are 20 to 29-year-old, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, and 50 to 59. You see that they make up a very small percentage of the population. And so as we look, 7% of the population, but 46% of those who are in prison in the state of Wisconsin. 7%, 43%, 5%, 39%, 4%, 37%. So you see these huge disparities, these huge differences in terms of blacks in the state and the percentage of them that are incarcerated in our prisons. And just to kind of show you this in more detail, if you look, there's a huge probability, depending on which age group you belong to, of having been incarcerated in the state of Wisconsin. This is data from 1990 to 2012 by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And what they did is they looked at the percentage of African-American men in Wisconsin who have been incarcerated at some time in their life in a state correctional facility. And you can see that for those in the age group 20 to 24, 17% have been incarcerated. 25 to 29, 36% have been incarcerated. The age group 30 to 34, over half have been incarcerated. 35 to 39, nearly half. 40 to 44-year-olds, nearly half. 45 to 49-year-olds, 41%, and 50 to 54-year-olds, 41%. So you can see that it's a huge problem within the African-American community in the state of Wisconsin. We have the highest incarceration rate for African-American males in the United States of America, but it's not just an issue here in Wisconsin. It's a nationwide issue. Incarceration issue is a nationwide issue. Even though it's done on a county-by-county basis, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment by U.S. residents born in 2001, you can see the huge disparities. Only 1 out of every 9 men nationwide is likely to spend time in prison. However, for white men, it's only 1 out of every 17. For black men, 1 out of every 3 has a chance of spending time in prison. Latino men, 1 out of every 6. For women, 1 out of every 56 women has a chance of spending time in prison. For white women, it's 1 out of every 111. For black women, 1 out of every 18, and for Latino women, 1 out of every 45. So you see these huge differences, these huge disparities that are a nationwide issue. We talk about mass incarceration as an issue, and I tell people that it's a much bigger problem than we really realize because we haven't looked at the data closely enough. We haven't really been informed or educated about the extent of the problem. In 1970, there were only about 300,000 people incarcerated in the United States in its prisons and its jails combined. And by 2014, we had 2.3 million people incarcerated. So imagine this. We're a country that makes up 5% of the population of the planet, but we make up 25% of the people who are incarcerated. And to look at it even more closely, if you look, there are only about 10 million people on the entire planet Earth that are incarcerated, and 2.2 million of them are currently residents of the United States of America. So we incarcerate at a much higher rate than any other country. Another thing that's directly related to this that you may have heard a million times, and I know that you all, if you've heard it, I know you believe it, but it's absolutely not true. You've heard it from a lot of people, including our former President Barack Obama. I heard him say this on numerous occasions, and every time I heard him say this, I was ready to jump through the television. I even sent him a letter with the evidence that he was wrong on this. I didn't get a reply from the White House with this letter with the data proving that he was wrong, but you probably heard people say that there are more black men in prison than there are in college. How many of you heard that before? All right? I mean, I've heard it a million times. This is what the evidence actually shows. It's a myth. It's not true. These are the numbers, and I got these numbers from the Department of Education as well as the Bureau of Justice Statistics. I wanted to look at the data myself to see, is it actually true? So we actually have 2 places you can be incarcerated in the United States. You can be incarcerated in prison, and you can be incarcerated in jail. If you're incarcerated in jail, that means you got a sentence of less than a year. If you get a sentence of a year or more, you're incarcerated in a prison. Most people who are incarcerated in jails are incarcerated for a very short period of time. The average amount of time that a person spends in jail across the U.S. is about 30 days. There's some people that spend extended times longer than that, but the average amount of time is about 30 days. So if we look at people that are in prison, these are people that are incarcerated for a year or more. In 2000, you had 653,000 black males who were in college and 572,000 who were in prison. In 2005, you had 774,000 black males in college and only 547,000 who were in prison. By 2010, over 1 million black males in college and only 561,000 in prison. And by 2015, 997,000 black males in college and 604,000 in prison. So that shows you that it's just a bogus statistic that people have heard and they've run with it without checking the numbers themselves. But it's much deeper than that, though. Because what I tell people is that when you think of the average college student, there aren't too many 95-year-old college students. There aren't too many 76-year-old college students. There aren't many 45-year-old college students. A majority of people who are in college are between the ages of 18 and 24. So if we were just to look at that particular group of black males, what we'll find is that for everyone who is incarcerated in a prison, there are 6 that are in college. Let me repeat that. For every 18 to 24-year-old black male who is incarcerated in a prison, there are 6 who are in college. So that breaks that myth down even further. And I get tired of hearing people repeat that. And every time I hear it, I'm always telling people you got it wrong. I show them the evidence, but then I hear them say the same thing again years later. And just to kind of show you that it's not just an issue, because it's an issue that is actually getting better. This is what I mean. If you look at the percentage of 18 to 24-year-old black males who are high school graduates who are in college, what you find is that there's a trend upward from 1986 to 2016. In 1986, there were about 29% of those within that demographic group were in college, but by 2016, it was over 41%. So you see the trend is an upward trend. That means a larger percentage of 18 to 24-year-old black males are attending college. It's getting better. But if you were to listen to, all of these prognosticators, all these talking heads, you would think that it's the exact opposite. That black males are not handling their business. They're not, they're not going to college. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. They're all locked up in prison. They're a bunch of thugs. They're a bunch of idiots. They don't do what they're supposed to do. That's why their community looks the way it looks. And it's the exact opposite in reality. They are doing what they're supposed to do. In fact, they're doing it at a level that they never imagined doing it back in the 1960s when Dr. King was assassinated. We've closed the gap in high school graduation rates. The gap, which used to be humongous between blacks and whites, has shrunken to about 7% now. And so we are making progress. Black males are doing what they're supposed to do. We would always hear as young black males, get your education. Get your education. That's exactly what we're doing. Consistently, however, people are not telling us that. They're not being truthful. And I always tell people, I was born in Mississippi. And when I was born in Mississippi, I was born in a segregated hospital. My mother had to go around to the back door to the colors-only entrance of the hospital. Little did I know that we left Mississippi and came to Milwaukee, the most segregated community in the country. Little did I know that I would be moving to the second most segregated state in the country. And when you compare yourself as a state to Mississippi, and Mississippi is doing better than you, you have some issues. So, Wisconsin has some issues. This is the percentage of 18 to 24-year-old black males who are high school graduates who are in college. 36% in Mississippi, only 26% in Wisconsin. You're going to let Mississippi beat you? Really? Mississippi is beating you in this demographic? That is absolutely shameful. And listen, I'm from Mississippi. I love Mississippi, but I hate Mississippi too. I don't have time to cover why. But the only state that's doing worse is actually the state of Nevada. Voting issues. We assume that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the act that gave blacks the right to vote, and everything is hunky-dory since then. There are consistent efforts to devalue the black vote. There are consistent efforts to make sure that people of color don't have the right to vote. And one of those efforts that took place here in Wisconsin was the passage of a voter ID law. And if we look at how this impacted Wisconsin, Milwaukee in particular, what we find is that eligible African-American voters are 182% less likely to possess an accepted photo ID than are whites. Eligible Latino voters are 206% less likely to possess an accepted photo ID than are whites. So obviously, the people who wanted to push this agenda of a voter ID, claiming that there was all of this voter fraud, which they've never been able to find proof of and show that evidence to anybody because it simply doesn't exist. These laws were passed nevertheless, and it's impacting the Black and Latino community tremendously. And so if you look there at the bottom, what you find are the percentage of eligible Milwaukee County voters who lack an accepted voter photo ID, and they also lack the required documents to get one. You can see that for blacks and Latinos, the number is significantly higher than it is for whites. So how does this impact our elections? If we look among the overall population eligible voters in Milwaukee County, a sizable portion do not possess an acceptable form of ID. That means that these people are not going to be able to vote. If you are a convicted felon who is still on supervised release, you cannot vote. If you are a convicted felon who is what they call off paper, your supervised release is over, you can legally vote. But people don't know. They think that if you're a convicted felon, you'll never be able to vote again. And I remember there was a billboard many years ago that I saw in the heart of the black community that warned people, if you're a convicted felon, if you vote, you're going to prison. It didn't say if you're a convicted felon and you're off paper, you can vote, but if you're a convicted felon that's on paper and vote, you're going to prison, which would have been more accurate. They scared people into not voting. And so you can see that there's a huge disparity. 63,085 eligible voters currently do not possess an accepted ID in Milwaukee County. And one of the interesting things that I discovered, we had an ordinance in Milwaukee that said if you got a municipal citation, jaywalking, spitting on the sidewalk, littering, whatever, and you didn't pay it, we literally suspended people's driver's licenses for 2 years. For 2 years. But they fixed it. It's only a year now. They fixed it. Your first DUI, 6 months suspension of your driver's license. A DUI where you actually run into somebody, a 1-year suspension. Jaywalking, ticket that you don't pay, 2-year suspension of your driver's privileges. In 2004, the federal government stopped giving states money for driver's education. So now if you want to get the ability to learn how to drive, you're not going to do it in high school. You're going to have to go and pay a driving company $400 on average. So we have a lot of poor people in Milwaukee who can't afford to pay that, who don't know how to drive properly. And you have all of these people who've had their licenses suspended simply because they made the mistake of not being able to afford to pay those tickets. We currently have in Milwaukee County 51,000 black males who don't have a valid driver's license. 51,000 black males in Milwaukee County do not have a valid driver's license. And most of them will never be able to vote. So where you look and you see people with the little stickers that say I voted, there are a lot of people who will not be able to wear those little stickers. Eligible voters who don't have all 3 documents required by DMV, these are the numbers in Milwaukee County. Nearly 23,000 blacks, nearly 10,000 Latinos who don't have the documents required to get the right to vote. And believe me, where you're born in the state of Wisconsin makes a difference. Black eligible voters are 2.5 times more likely to be born outside of Wisconsin than whites. Latino eligible voters are nearly 4 times likely to be born in a state other than Wisconsin. So eligible voters born in Wisconsin, 81.1% of white eligible voters were born in the state. Only 51% of black eligible voters were born in the state, and only 28% of Latino eligible voters were born in the state of Wisconsin. So if you come from another state and you have to figure out how to get those documents from another state, it may be kind of difficult. In addition to that, because of felon disenfranchisement laws, 1 of every 13 African Americans has lost their voting rights. 1 in every 56 non-black voters has lost the right to vote. And if you look at this map shows you how bad it is from state to state. So you see the darker hued states, the percentages are much higher. You see that there are literally 4 states where more than 20% of African Americans have lost their right to vote. In fact, in some states, once you're a convicted felon, you're never able to vote again, ever. In the state of Florida, you actually literally have to petition the governor to get the right to vote again. And you can see that there are several states where those numbers are significantly high. This next slide is to show you that I told you earlier that most of the blacks in the state live in 4 counties. Majority of those live in Milwaukee, Racine, Kenosha County. And when you are arrested, you are adjudicated through the system, and you are sent to prison. Many of those prisons are not anywhere near those communities where blacks live. This is a map. There are 72 counties in the state. There are 23 counties where more than 10% of the population that lives in that county that are black are incarcerated. So blacks who are from Milwaukee are incarcerated all over the state. They count as residents of those new counties. So when they're drawing maps for representation in state government, those black people who are incarcerated in those prisons as far north as Douglas and Bayfield County are counted as residents of those counties instead of being counted as residents of Milwaukee, Racine, Kenosha, wherever they're from, which would be fair. So what ends up happening, we have a huge problem of people incarcerated far away from where they live. And it's even worse, though, because we have imported prisoners to rural communities. These 12 counties, more than 40% of the people who are currently residents of those counties who are black are incarcerated. Fond du Lac, 91%. Waushara, 86%. Jackson, 86%. Dodge County, 85%. Adams County, 84%. Crawford County, 74%. Chippewa County, 73%. Juneau County, 68%. Sawyer County, 61%. Columbia County, 60%. Oneida County, 51%. Grant County, 44.4%. Of the black people who live in those counties are not people who are walking around free. They are incarcerated in a state prison. And people in Wisconsin simply do not know this. I showed someone a map of where blacks live by numbers, by county, and one of the guys was like, man, I didn't know there were so many black people living up north. And I was like, yeah, they are living up there. They're not living where they want to live, but they're living up north in Douglas County, Bayfield County, which I guarantee you, ask the average black person in Milwaukee where Douglas or Bayfield County is, they wouldn't be able to tell you if you offered them $1 million. Because believe me, prior to me making that map that you just saw, I didn't know where Douglas and Bayfield counties were either. I'd heard of them, but I had no clue where they were. But it's worse. We have 56 predominantly black neighborhoods in the state of Wisconsin. 31 of them are jails or prisons. There are 15 cities where the only black neighborhood is a jail. Blacks are 6.3% of the population in the state, but 43% of the people in our state prisons are black. When you look at incarceration rates, these are incarceration rates, male and female included. The rate for blacks, you can see, is significantly higher than the rate for Latinos as well as whites. Wisconsin is one of only 5 states where the black rate is more than 10 times the white rate. The rate for black males is the highest in the country. And you can see that based on this, that we over-incarcerate blacks. Here's another few things I want to share with you. Wisconsin is the highest incarceration rate for black males, nearly twice the national average. 1 out of every 20 black adult males in the state is incarcerated. We have the 6th highest Latino incarceration rate in the nation. We have the 2nd highest American Indian incarceration rate in the nation. We always talk about the black incarceration rate in Wisconsin. We never talk about the Latino incarceration rate or the Native American incarceration rate. So we're an equal opportunity discriminator. The next thing I want to cover with you is the issue of people killed by police. These are numbers taken from 2 different sources. There's a website called Mapping Police Violence, which tracks people killed while they have encounters with the police, and there's another, the UK Guardian newspaper keeps a database that they call The Counted. And these are the numbers of people who have died at the hands of police over the last few years. So 264 so far, and that number may be even higher because I got that number in the middle of last week. Last year, 1,146. The year before that, 1,146. 2016, 1,093. So we don't hear about all of these. We don't hear about many of these. We heard about a lot of the blacks who were killed, you know, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Freddie Gray, Tamir Rice. We've heard those stories. But how many of you heard the names of any blacks who were killed by police last year? Probably 0. Because all of those blacks who were killed last year, there's not a single one of those cases that ended up being a high-profile, nationally talked about case. whereas the year before we talked about a lot of those cases. So the narrative has changed, and those cases are typically not talked about. There are currently a couple cases that are high profile that we're talking about, but I just want to show you, break down these numbers a little bit better. So in 2017, last year, 92% of the people who were killed were actually were shot by police. Officers were charged with crime in only 13 of those cases. 9 of the 13 cases had video evidence, either from the police dash cam or the police body camera. Officers were identified in 569 cases. So consistently, we hide the identity of these officers who kill people. We don't know. It's very difficult to find out who these officers are. I remember the case of Freddie Brown. It was several months before we found out the name of Darren Wilson. At least 48 had killed someone before. 12 had multiple prior shootings on their record. 89% were killed after police stopped them for a traffic violation. So once again, when I talk to you about that police officer pulling that gun, pointing in my face and asking me if I had a death wish, it wasn't a joke. It was something that's very serious. You're more likely to be shot by the police as a traffic violation than any other encounter with police. 640 cases, police were responding to suspected nonviolent offenses. So we're not talking about, oh, the police just heard somebody just strong-arm rob somebody. Oh, they just carjacked somebody with a gun. They are responding to nonviolent offenses. 149 people killed were unarmed. That number is actually off. That should be 449. 170 had a knife or sharp object. 112 had a vehicle. 617 had a gun. That should be 1,149. My mistake. Were unarmed. So, of the 149 unarmed, wait a minute, let me look at this. 51 were white. The numbers for 170, 112, and 617, those were people who were armed or unarmed. My mistake on that slide, I'll have to fix that. But of the 149 who were unarmed, 51 were white, 49 were black, 34 were Hispanic, 2 were Asian, and 2 were Native people. So I had a discussion with my brother just the other day, and I told him that there are a lot of white people who are killed by police. You'll never hear about it on the news, though. You never, ever hear about whites who are armed or unarmed, in most cases, who are killed by police, unless it's some like mass shooting or something. You'll hear about those, but a majority of the people who are killed by police consistently year after year are white people. But the numbers don't reflect the disparity because of obviously blacks as well as Hispanics are a smaller percentage of the population. And this is the last slide I have for you. People killed by police in 2017. Blacks are 13% of the population, but they were 27% of the people killed by police. And they were 35% of the people who were unarmed who were killed by police. And they were 34% of the people who were unarmed and not in an attack mode in the encounter with the police. Hispanics, 17% of the population, 21% of people killed by police, 25% of the unarmed people killed by police, 32% of the unarmed who were not attacking. For whites, 63% of the population, non-Hispanic whites, 48% of people killed by police were non-Hispanic whites, 37% of the unarmed people were white, 32% of those who were unarmed and not attacking were white, and then the other groups you see the much smaller number. So I want to end by just sharing this with you. One of the things that I try to talk to people about is the fact that we put a great deal of faith in the system that we live in. We celebrate the Constitution, we celebrate the Bill of Rights, we celebrate our police departments, we celebrate our court systems, we celebrate them as being fair. But the reality is they're simply not fair. And part of the reason that they're not fair is because they've never been fair. It isn't as if it's an accident. When you look back historically, these disparities have existed since the beginning of America. I did a series of presentations that are called Do Black Lives Matter? The historical devaluation of black lives in American history. And going back to 1619, there has always been different levels of treatment for blacks versus whites in our country. And these things have become institutionalized. This is why I always say it's not about individual acts of racism, people who are prejudiced, all those things, people who are bigots. Those things are important, obviously. But what's more important, the things that we can work on are the institutional ramifications, those institutions that perpetuate these disparities year after year, decade after decade. The same things that we're complaining about today, Dr. King was complaining about in 1968. 50 years later, we're complaining about the exact same things. We're complaining about poverty. We're complaining about police brutality. We're complaining about disparities within the criminal justice system. What has really changed in the last 50 years? Not a whole lot. Thank you all so much. Appreciate your time.
So I'll ask our respondents to say a few words, perhaps starting with Dr. Jones.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate his expertise, and this, I teach in the Department of English here. My name is Glenda Jones, and I'm really interested in social justice, what people write about as far as movements and social justice movements, and I'm also very interested in education as an institution, and I also teach women and gender studies, so I teach about feminism and feminist movements. And I just wanted to point out a few of the parallels. One is that you gave the quote from Du Bois, and he said that the civil rights movement was necessary because of racial hate, exploitation, and oppression. Well, Bell Hooks, who is also a black feminist scholar, said feminism is a movement to overcome sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. So a lot of what I know about race and civil rights has come up because of the feminist movement, which started the second wave really after Martin Luther King, and then expanded into racial minorities, especially women, but then into the LGBTQ movement. I just wanted to say that on a personal note, I think really an anecdote is all I can really add to this at this point, is that many of you know that I'm raising 3 children that are black. My son is 9 years old, and he has cognitive and neurological disabilities. He's on the autism spectrum. So I've had the opportunity to see from a personal experience as his mother and his advocate how he's treated differently in the education system. We live here in Menominee, and so the main bulk of people of color, as well as, well, not just African Americans, but anyone, live in the affordable housing area, which goes to River Heights Elementary School. And we actually live in that area now, but he's bused to Wakanda Elementary because of his autism. And he's entitled to free and appropriate education. That would be one of his rights. And what I have found is that a narrative has been created about him over time. I was getting notes all the time about his behavior, about issues they had with him. And I started underlining phrases and words that really described him in a racial construction, a social construction of him as being more aggressive, more, just his blackness was a problem for them. And last year it really came to a head when I had to have a meeting, and we found out that one of the paraeducators had hid from him. She went into a bathroom because she feared him. He was 8. And certainly not physically challenging in a way that would have hurt her. So people are bringing their fears into the classroom, and then he's not getting the same kind of free and appropriate education that other people are getting. So many false narratives still exist, and I think that's something that we need to really think about. If we're going to say that people should be allowed a free and appropriate education in the system, just as you said that we don't have a single criminal justice system, we don't have a single education system, and everywhere we go in this country it's going to be a little bit different, and certainly needs a lot of improvement. I think I'll just leave it there and go ahead and let Virginia speak for a few minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Lee.
I'm not going to get up because I have a a leg that has succumbed to the ice, and so it's a lot better than it was, but it's still a little challenge. I just want to thank you so much for this information. I know you're coming to my class in a minute, which will be of enormous importance, I think, to my students. I don't know how much we can share in the short time that we're there, but maybe those of us who would like, I believe it's being recorded, so those of us who would like to see the YouTube or whatever, or the PowerPoint will have access. I think Glenda is completely right, is that one of the issues, a little louder, I'll try. I've got this thing on top of the leg, right? I'm fine, it's just, one of the things that I wanted to maybe add, because it's important to me, and I think that's why we're here, is because we're working in areas that are tangential to the information that you've shared, is that so many of my students come from segregated backgrounds, and they do not have access, at least through their high schools. When they come here, they have a little bit more access, but they are very busy with other aspects of their lives, and unless they have a reason for genuinely caring about the lives of people that they don't necessarily have contact with very often, they'll take in some information. They maybe even write a really brilliant paper for my multiculturalism class about the context for learning in the schools that they frequent for 13 weeks during the semester. But then it's gone, and we don't follow up enough to find out how it's impacted. My students are pre-service teachers, so we do need to do research to follow up with them. So I think Lenda's point about how we try to interdict the narratives that students encounter as they're growing up in their high schools, in their lives, in the media, at school here at Stout, right, in their religious institutions and so on, find out the ways in which those are contributing to our reinforcing, those of us who are white people, how many of us spend every day of our lives thinking about an issue like race, you know, and is a little more relevant to Glenda and myself as white people, not right people. Myself, my husband is here, and we've known each other since we were teenagers, and hence the experience of and we're not teenagers anymore, and the experience of being involved in a white supremacist, I would say, environment all those years, right, and finding that things have not really changed that much since then, as your information points out, is stark, right, and our students have, very few of them have any idea if they're not people of color. I just wanted to back up what you're saying very quickly. We have a grandson who is he's not much lighter than Reggie or Babatunde, my husband. And he went to a preschool in, we live in St. Paul, and he's now in kindergarten, so he's in a public school. But he was coming home disturbed. And we weren't quite sure what it was, and eventually he was able to explain to his mother and to ourselves that the problem was that his friends would not allow him to be a superhero in their games. Oh. And the reason for that was because he's black, because he has a dark skin, because that's not familiar in the narratives that they encounter through the media, through their lives at home, at play, and so on. So we were able to talk with him, and as I did with our own daughters, with 3 daughters, to begin to convince them, which is a challenge, right, that these narratives that they're going to encounter through their lives, which the police and others will and come to embody, will come to use as justifications, just as race was invented as a myth to justify slavery and colonialism, it is still being used to justify the system within which we live and the social and economic hierarchy that we encounter daily. So I hope, we pray that our grandson is going to do as well as our 3 daughters. And black women encounter just as many challenges as black men, but in some cases a little different. I just wanted to throw that out there, that here you've got 2 people who live the world as white people with all the privileges that encounter, who are very much aware of the challenges that their deeply loved ones are experiencing. And Reggie, thank you very much.
I have 2 last things real quick I want to share with you. One, I want to make a correction. So on this slide, I had a brain fart. My apologies. These are the 149 people who were killed were unarmed. Inside the paragraph are the people who were armed. Okay. So there were 170 who were armed with a knife or a sharp object, 112 who were armed with a vehicle, 617 had guns. So that's a correction to that. My apologies for that. And I want to just kind of respond to what you 2 both shared. One of the things that I've been telling people as I've been traveling around the state of Wisconsin in particular is that because we live in these segregated spaces, we don't get to know people from other groups. We don't get to understand anything about them. So everything that we think we know about them is based on what we get on a daily basis from movies, from television, from books, from stories that we hear from people. And because we don't get to know people, we have to make up some way to see who they are. In many cases, we make up these images of who they are based on stereotypes that we've heard. So we encounter people and we don't see them as an individual, we see them as a stereotype. And the only way to get past that, I've been doing a series I call The Hidden Impact of Segregation, and I share at the end of that, the only way to get past that is for all of us to make a concerted effort to get outside of the little bubble that we live in, those segregated bubbles that we not just live in, we occupy segregated spaces. We shop in different places, we worship in different places, we live in different places, we play in different places, so we don't have encounters with people from other groups, so we don't have a level of comfort. You have to get out of your comfort zone, become a person who is comfortable being in an uncomfortable space. It absolutely has to happen, otherwise we're going to be talking about this exact same thing 50 years from now. So take it upon yourself to build genuine relationships with people from a group that you've never had a relationship with before. This is something that I've been on a mission to do the last 4 years of my life. I've made it a mission of mine to get to know people from every community in Milwaukee. So I've gotten to know people from the Jewish community, which I never knew any Jewish people before. I've gotten to know people from the Muslim community. I've gotten to know people from the Hmong community, the Puerto Rican community, the Mexican community, the LGBT community, every community you can imagine in Milwaukee. I've gotten to know people from those communities because I think it's important for me to get outside of the bubble that I lived in. I lived in a segregated bubble. Every student that was in my class from 3rd through 8th grade was black. I didn't go to school with white kids in Milwaukee until I got to 9th grade. However, in 2nd grade in Mississippi, I went to school with white kids in Mississippi. Once again, Wisconsin, you should be ashamed of yourself. So I just wanted to share that with you all. Thank you all so much.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.